Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Bulletin News. Our special episode today will be tackling public debt and the devastating effects COVID-19 had on the Namibian economy. In our analysis and discussions, we'll be utilizing the writings of multiple authors whose names you can find in the news ribbon on the bottom of the screen. Let's kick things off with a general introduction on public debt from our correspondent Azzouz Ribai, live from our studio. Azzouz?
Thank you, Hussein. So public debt is the amount of money borrowed by a government of a country. It includes all financial commitments made by a country or its various public institutions to finance their operation. In the majority of cases, public debt takes the form of government bonds. There are two types of public debt. The internal public debt concerning the national economic actors like national banks, like national stock market, and there is the second one is the external public debt concerning foreign governments, international organizations like the IMF. So our question today, how governments will deal with public debt in these difficult times? Let's take a closer look together throughout this episode. Back to you, Hussein.
Thank you, Azzouz, for providing our viewers with this overview on the topic and for kickstarting our discussion. Today, our focus will be on the Namibian economy, where an estimated amount of 5 to 7.5 billion Namibian dollars is lost in GDP, owing to the impact of the lockdown measures on the various sectors in the primary, secondary, and service industries. Although the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic impacts all sectors and everyone in the country, there are those that are hard hit depending on the basis of their operations, like the tourism and non-formal business sectors. Tourism was one of the bigger sectors in the country, contributing to about 5.2 billion to the gross domestic product in 2015, and up to 15 million when you consider the indirect impact of the sector. The lockdown period, therefore, has had a significant impact on both international and domestic tourism. Apart from those that come from Africa, most of the country's international tourists come from countries like Germany, France, US, Italy, Spain, Canada, UK, and China. Countries that are most hit by the virus and in line with the traveling ban policy measures. The implications are that it might take longer before Namibia gets back to receiving international tourists again. The World Tourism Organization in 2020 estimated that the expected impact on world tourism to be a fall between 20 to 30%. In Namibia, if a 20% fall is applied on the current contributions of the sector, it implies a loss of about $1 million Namibian dollars. The informal business sector in Namibia, which is represented by informal business enterprises such as small builders, barbers, hairdressers, taxis and bus transport operators, employs almost 500,000 Namibians who found themselves hard hit with the lockdown measures. On April 2nd, the government, through the Ministry of Finance, launched an economic stimulus and relief package totaling to 8.1 billion Namibian dollars in response to COVID-19. However, the stimulus is linked to supporting the job retention in the formal sector, and there is little in this intervention that speaks to the citizens who run non-VAT registered businesses in the informal business enterprises. For a more in-depth analysis of the situation in Namibia, we move to our senior correspondent Marissa on the ground from the Namibian capital. Marissa, you're live in Erfurt.
Thank you, Hussein, for the introduction. The COVID-19 pandemic has reached all corners of the world, and you can certainly feel it here in Windhoek as we enter into our summer months. We begin our coverage here on the ground on Namibia's government revenue and how that has fared in response to the pandemic. Namibia's tax revenue, including tax on individuals, profits, value-added tax, and taxes on international trade, accounts to around 80% of the country's government revenue as a whole. During the 3-week lockdown, many non-essential shops were closed, which is likely to result in the loss of jobs. And with less jobs means less taxpayers, and less taxpayers means a reduction in tax revenue. Although we do not know the exact job losses, we can estimate against the losses in the United States provided by the Federal Reserve Bank in New York City, that we should also expect a decrease here. And once I get those numbers from the officials here on the ground, you'll be the first to know. The global supply chains have also not been exempt from this catastrophe. As we experience nationwide lockdowns across the globe, the movement of goods will continue to become more and more restricted, and therefore more expensive. This also includes the necessary PPE to combat the virus, and the government will have to spend more on such items. And in addition, the Namibian dollar has not fared well against the US dollar, deteriorating from $14 to $19 in just 5 short months. Namibia itself, which has invested for years into its transportation infrastructure, prides itself in it, and as a gateway to trade in Africa. As you can see behind me, Windhoek remains a bustling and beautiful city. However, travel restrictions due to the pandemic have halted many procedures, disrupted the flow of goods, and closed ports and airports. Not only that, but many of Namibia's major trade partners have closed their borders as well, and that has had a detrimental effect on the demand of Namibian goods. We will remain here on standby in Windhoek as the situation unfolds, and now let's move on to our analysis room. Back to you.
Thank you, Marissa, for your in-depth report on the situation in Namibia. To discuss next steps for the Namibian economy, I would like to welcome our guest for this morning, Jesus Winzulu. Jesus is an MPP candidate at Erfurt's very own William Brandt School of Public Policy and is currently working with a team of students on the Namibian case in their Public Administration and Finance course under the supervision of Dr. Akim Kimmerling. Jesus, welcome to the Bulletin. We unfortunately had to do this via web conferencing due to stricter Corona regulations, but it's great to have you nonetheless.
Thank you so much, Hussein and guys, for having me here. I'm right here in the University of Erfurt with a great view at the bibliothèque. So let's go into it. Before we go into the analysis, Hussein, we need to take into account 2 more aspects of the Namibian economy: private consumption and financial sector. Undoubtedly, private consumption was affected by the lockdown measures of the Namibian government, since all retail shops, with the exception of grocery stores and pharmacies, were forced to close. This means less consumption both by people in goods such as clothes and alcohol that cannot sell, and any other business to restock. Furthermore, the restriction results in more unemployment, and therefore Namibian families suffer a reduction of income, shrinking consumption even further. Though there are some sectors that enjoy increasing demand, such as health equipment, sanitary products, or telecommunications, the overall consumption still faces negative numbers. The financial sector, we need to remember, is characterized by expectations, and its worst enemy is uncertainty, feeling that this pandemic only worsens. The disruption of supply chains creates bad expectations for the import-dependent economies such as Namibia. The stock market suffered an all-time low fall of 33.73% at the beginning of 2020. The COVID economic stimulus package of $8.1 billion Namibian dollars announced by the government, mainly directed to support businesses and households, made the index bounce back, but the fluctuation is not expected to cease until the health crisis is under control. The interest rates had been lowered to stimulate the economy, to stimulate credit, and avoid modifying the exchange rate between the Namibian dollar and the South African rand, but investments won't grow until the situation stabilizes. Taking about currency, the fall of the Namibian dollar against the US dollar from 14 to 19.01 Namibian dollars per dollar represents a big problem for the Namibian government and the country, which depends on fuel and oil imports, a situation that could precipitate stagflation if not handled.
Very insightful indeed, thank you. And what does your team think of Julius Nugulu and Homateni's writings on Namibia?
The analysis from Julius Nugulu and Homateni reflects the characteristic of orthodox economics. First, they neglect inflation from their analysis, reflecting the common thought that unemployment and inflation are opposite phenomena. Nevertheless, we need to remember that Namibian imports most of its food and oil, meaning that even if unemployment grows, supply chain disruption and currency depreciation would also cause something called cost-push inflation. That means too few goods chasing too much money. And finally, stagflation if not managed. This is something that might normally not affect self-sufficient economies such as the US or France that can get their own oil or their own food, but it certainly affects countries such as Namibia. Second, the analysis drives impact predictions based either from the early impact of COVID on the Namibian economy or from the impact it had in developed economies such as the US. And we know Namibian economy and US economy are not alike. This, along with unpredictability of the development such as the type of crisis in the country, makes prediction less accurate. Right now, the contraction of the GDP is expected to be way higher than in the research, throwing GDP almost to 2016 levels. Third, the analysis required more recommendations to reactivate the income sources of the Namibian government: international tax, trade tax, income taxes, and added value taxes, and to manage public debt and currency depreciation. It acknowledges the importance of stabilizing regional trade and including the informal sector as a way to reduce government burden. But it needs to acknowledge the problem of how to finance public expenditure in a moment of low income right now. In general, the policy recommendations follow a top-down approach and could benefit from including the population in the discussion and giving them tools to help contain the pandemic without paralyzing the economy, such as happened in South Korea. Thank you so much for having me here. It's been a pleasure, and I hope it has been helpful.
Thank you so much, Jesus, for joining us this morning. It was a pleasure having you. Indeed, very helpful information. And one can always critique a scholarly article. The editorial team here at the Bulletin was actually discussing the methodology of the authors in said article and how they keep comparing the projected economic predictions to economies like the United States, which opens up a discussion about how accurate can such comparison actually be. Thank you for watching the Bulletin. Concluding remarks with our correspondent, Azuz.
Thank you, Hussein. So, as you all have seen, the analysis from our experts and correspondent on the ground suggests that the corona crisis and the lockdown had dramatic effect on the Namibian economy. Higher unemployment, higher inflation, a drop in the private consumption, less income from the Namibian public fund. The next 3 weeks and months will be difficult. The Namibian government will have to deal with the increase of public debt and must find the necessary funds to cover its expenses and face the crisis. Thank you for watching the Bulletin News, live from Erfurt.